So good morning. We're live, and good morning, colleagues. Again, I'm Terrence Blackman, associate professor and chair of the Department of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And as is our practice, I want to welcome you to this episode of Transforming Guyana. This is season 2, episode 12. Yes, it is the final episode of the second season. And today we decided to look at diversification, think about how Guyana might avoid over-reliance on the oil and gas industry. And joining me today is Dr. Lauren Sobers, who's standing in for our regular uh, co-host from the Caribbean Policy Dr. David Lewis, who is traveling today. So I wanted to ask Dr. Sobers to just broadly say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Caribbean Policy Forum.
Okay, thank
Dr.
you.
Sobers.
Thank you. Good day, and I'm really pleased to be here today representing the Caribbean Policy Consortium. I am a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. You can find our website at cpccaribbean.org. I am a lecturer at the University of West Indies, and I've been in the oil and gas industry for 20 years. I look forward to this topic, particularly for Guyana. I'm more familiar with the Trinidad story and a bit of the Guyana story, so I'm really looking forward to what our panelists have to say, and I would share my thoughts at the appropriate time. Thank you, Terence.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Sobers. So what did we have in store for us today? So this theme of the episode is about avoiding over-reliance on the oil and gas industry. And so I went out to look for data on, the extent to which the oil industry dominates our export. To what extent were we reliant on the oil industry? And what I discovered was that we essentially our in 2022, Guyana exported a total of $18.5 billion. So it's ranking Guyana as the 80th, uh, as the 80th exporter in the world. And and during the last 5 years, exports from Guyana have changed by $16.4 billion from 2.12 billion in 2017 to 18.5 billion in 2022. And if we note what's going on here, the most recent exports are led by crude petroleum. It's almost more than 80%, 15.9 billion. Gold bringing a really poor second at about 1.3 billion, and rice about just 429 million. Aluminum ore just 192 million, and our perennial favorite, hard liquor, coming in at about really fractional percentages. So the data essentially is saying that there's no question about whether or not the economy is, as it stands, super reliant on the oil and gas industry. And I think the question for us is to think through, how do we get to the place where uh, how do we get to that place where we can meaningfully manage this transition? I guess the essential point is that, look, oil and gas are not going to be here forever, and the fact this means that we have to be prepared for a world beyond oil and gas, and so somehow we have to do some investments that will sustain us in the long run. And I think this is the challenge. This is the challenge that is upon us. And today, to kind of talk about this challenge, uh, we have Arnold McIntyre, Arthur Deacon, and Lauren Sobers. And as many of you know, Arnold has worked with the IMF. He's been involved with Guyana for many years. Arthur is co-director at American Market Intelligence, and he's also been really involved with issues related to Guyana over many years. And Lorraine is similarly someone who's been involved with this program, someone who has been thinking a lot about questions of energy and the environment, and as part of her work at the University of West Indies, and certainly been involved with issues related to Guyana. So I want to welcome them all, and I want to finally add Arthur to our to the program, and to say that the way we're going to do things, at least structurally, is I wanted Arthur to kind of give us some sense of the what has happened. You know, when we part of the reason is that Arthur was the first guest on the first program 2 years ago, and to sort of set the stage about where the industry was. And so I wanted to sort of, in a sense, bring you back 2 years later to say, you know, help us to understand where the industry is today. And then when we're done, I want to ask Dr. McIntyre to really help us to contextualize this in the context of diversification and avoiding the over-reliance on oil and gas. And so with that said, I'm going to jump into it and ask you, Arthur, to take the lead here and give us a sense of where we are today in relation to ExxonMobil, Guyana. You know, how many billion barrels of recoverable oil? Where are we today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Terrence. Happy to be back here after 2 years. Lots has happened, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that remain the same. So I'm just going to set the scene first with some data, and then after that, I'll get into some more, let's say, philosophical discussion points. So in terms of production right now, Guyana is at about 650,000 barrels per day. This was as of end of Q1 2024. That makes it the fourth largest in Latin America, behind Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And that amount is expected to grow to 1.3 million by 2027, so double that amount, putting it as the third largest in the region, behind Brazil and Mexico. And as you know, most of the audience knows, Brazil and Mexico are trillion-dollar economies. They have hundreds of millions of people, 200 million plus in Brazil, 100 plus million in Mexico. So the fact that Guyana, with 800,000 people, is getting closer to the production numbers in those two countries really shows the scale of wealth that Guyana is about to and is already receiving. If you look at Brent crude, which is at around $82 per barrel, if you consider 650,000 barrels per day, which is the latest estimates, that is $53 million per day in oil, and per year that's $19 billion. Similar to some of the figures that Terrence showed earlier in terms of exports. Of course, there's costs are not included in this. There's royalties. There's different taxes in some situations. So 19 billion is not what's left over for any single party, but that's let's call it the raw amount, based on just the production value of a barrel and the total production, which is 650,000 barrels per day. By 2027, that's supposed to double. So let's say 38 billion per year. It's a pretty astronomical number. So Guyana uses less than 5% of the oil produced domestically. Almost all of it is exported to countries across the world, India, US, other countries just across the Western and Eastern world. Guyana has had over 30 different discoveries since 2015. Its level, its speed in which it's developed those developments and those discoveries is essentially unprecedented. A large part of it is due to Exxon's technical expertise, experience, and just capabilities. I think also the fact that the energy transition is putting pressure on fossil fuel producing economies. I think the government of Guyana and Exxon realized that the environment around multi-billion barrel production might not be as favorable in 5 years as it is now or as it was a few years ago. So I think it's the idea of maximizing as much as you can before there is any backlash. The Starbuck consortium is made by Exxon, Hess, and Sinuk. Chevron is trying to acquire the Hess portion. There's been some issues with that. Basically, Exxon says that they have right of first refusal in terms of who actually purchases that portion. Hess argues that right of first refusal doesn't actually apply, since this is more of a corporate merger than a singular asset sale. Basically, there's a 3-person panel right now, one appointee from Chevron, one from Exxon, and a third one, which is, as far as I know, unknown. And they're going to likely decide whether or not that deal goes through by Q3 of this year, or the hearing is taking place in Q3 of this year. After that is decided, they would still need a approval by the FTC and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission to make sure that there's no antitrust issues and whatnot. So those are the 3 main players in the Starbuck consortium. Of course, a discovery of this size has attracted many other multinationals into Guyana: Schlumberger, Caterpillar, Halliburton, all of those companies that have had decades of experience in the oil and gas sector have established some type of operations in Guyana to support Exxon. The reality is, similar to 2 years ago, a lot of the, especially when it comes to oil and gas, is focused on the Starbuck consortium. There has been a couple of promising discoveries in some of the other blocks, but the reality is that 99% of the work and the attention and the revenues are related to Starbuck consortium as of now. Hopefully that changes to create more diversification, but right now Exxon holds all the cards, and is rightfully so maximizing the revenue potential from these discoveries. And in terms of the 30 discoveries, that is equivalent to around 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil and gas. These are the largest offshore discoveries in the past decade or even more. So it's pretty significant. And no matter how you paint it, it's a major discovery. The reality is that there's been pretty favorable regulatory framework for Exxon to accelerate this development. There was no taxes, I believe, in the first PSA structure between Exxon and the government. The amount of royalties is pretty low in terms of global standards. So it really did encourage a massive amount of investment by Exxon, because there was an opportunity to enjoy those profits. At the same time, when you have a very frontier market like Guyana, where there's extreme amount of risk, political risk, but also geological risk, because you don't know what's out there, you do tend to have very favorable contracts, at least in the beginning. And then as things progress, as there's more clarity on the situation, those contracts tend to become a little bit more rigid for the producers and a little bit more favorable for the governments. And that's the expectation of what's going to happen in Guyana. Now, just moving more in terms of let's call it philosophical questions before I turn it back to you, Terence. I think where Guyana finds itself 2 years later from the first time I spoke here, of course, there's been more development on the ground. You see it with new construction happening in Georgetown. new bridges, new commercial spaces, improved roads in certain situations. But I think the reality is that most of the Guyanese people, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I can't speak for the Guyanese people in any shape or form, but it feels like they are still waiting for some type of more material benefit from this oil discovery. I don't really know what the right way of distributing these funds are. I think single cash distributions to families often don't really work out. The best way is to create employment opportunities and invest this money for multi-generational wealth, sustainable wealth, and reinvesting into infrastructure such as schools and hospitals and roads and other things that lead to more development in a broader scale. So I think that's still a big question mark, is how to efficiently and effectively deploy this money. I think there's some issues with the sovereign wealth fund that I don't want to go too deep into, but there's quite a lot of political involvement, and it would be favorable if there was some separation between how the monies are managed and the political branches of government. But overall, for a country that has never dealt with this amount of wealth and these types of resources, it has done fairly well in terms of creating a sovereign wealth fund, in terms of creating the investment framework to attract more producers. Of course, it's all based on the attractiveness of that commodity, right? If there wasn't that commodity in place, it would be hard for the Guyanese government to do anything to attract these types of producers. But I think what I'm trying to say is that both the government and Exxon seem to need each other in terms of, okay, the government needs Exxon to keep generating revenues, and then Exxon needs Guyana to keep returning profits to their shareholders, right? So it's a codependent type of relationship, and both of them have to keep supporting each other in terms of helping create an environment to maximize the revenues and to distribute those revenues accordingly to the people. So I'm going to leave it at that, and we can touch upon more of those later in the call. Thanks, Terrence.
Thank you, Arthur. I think you raised a number of very, very important points, and I think in some sense this is the kind of perfect setup for Dr. McIntyre, which is to kind of give us some sense of your thinking in this regard. I mean, our broad framing about over-reliance on the oil and gas sector and sort of putting in place some infrastructure for sustainability and for over time, and some mechanism for ensuring that that the people, the Guyanese people, in some genuine sense, experience some tangible sense of the wealth. And so, give us your insights here, Dr. McIntyre.
Thank you, Arthur, and also Terry. Thank you, Terrence, and also thank you, Arthur. That was very insightful and very up to date. Certainly more up to date than I am. And good morning to everyone. I think Arthur's statistics make it clear that the size of the Guyanese oil find is very substantial and potentially transformative. The last number I looked at, and Arthur, you probably have more recent numbers than me, we have about 11 to 12 billion barrels of commercially recoverable oil, puts Guyana somewhere in the midpoint of oil producers in the world, I think. But when you look at recoverable oil per capita, Guyana is second or third, along with the Emiratis, UAE, and Qatar. And that is something that we have to look at very, very, very fundamentally. This very small population with this huge resource rent Typically, Terence, countries that discover extractive commodities with the potential for significant resource rents, we know they all face this challenge of Dutch disease, where spending outstrips capacity in the country to supply, either in labor or goods. We get an inflationary spiral, and then we get a very unstable exchange rate, and macroeconomic conditions become very difficult. So the near-term challenge for Guyana is to maintain stability, not let inflation get out of hand. The need to invest substantial parts of the oil rents and revenues into lifting living standards, strengthening infrastructure, better healthcare, education, and greater skills for the population is well established, because Guyana is coming from a relatively low base relative to the rest of the Caribbean. And even if it weren't, these are very fundamental pillars for long-term sustainable development. We should recognize that Guyana has always been a commodity country. Guyana has typically depended on mining, gold and bauxite, sugar and rice, mainly in the agricultural sector. Oil has come in, and by virtue of the size of the oil find, the oil sector is becoming dominant in the commodity space and the economic space. But a lack of diversification has always been part of the economic land space in Guyana. There are very limited linkages between the commodity sector and the rest of the economy. There's no significant manufacturing sector, for example, with which those linkages could be formed. A recent analysis pointed out that these lack of linkages is reflected that labor mobility between industries in Guyana is very limited. So as you get some industries expanding, it does not seem to stimulate the movement of labor across industries. The difficulty of labor shifting across industries is due to the industry-specific skills as well as occupation-related skills. So in other words, bauxite workers are not exactly transferable, a lot of them to the rest of the economy. Guyana's undiversified economic base constrains its potential to integrate with domestic production. So that the lack of a sophisticated manufacturing capacity is limiting Guyana's ability to produce most oil sector inputs like petrochemicals, etc. This is where we start. So the case for diversification is very strong, not only for having more broad-based growth, expansion of non-oil sectors as the economy evolves over the next 10 to 20 years is going to be critical to spread the benefits of economic benefits and development dividend in Guyana, but it's also by reducing the dominance of oil. That's one of the ways to avoid the Dutch disease long term, because you don't have this single booming economic sector. Many countries have tried, in all resource-rich countries have tried to diversify, but with mixed results. The Gulf countries have diversified into capital-intensive sectors, as well as oil-producing downstream sectors such as value chains and other energy-intensive industry. Trinidad and Tobago also pursued this into refining fuels, LPG, petrochemicals, gas-related industries like methanol, etc. The government in Guyana has made clear that economic diversification is a medium to long-term priority. I would suggest that to be able to implement a strategy of diversification in the coming decade, some fundamentals have to be addressed. The first of these is the weak infrastructure in Guyana. This is a very large country. Population is spread over a very large landmass. There are concentrations in Georgetown and other places. A lot of the country is not connected with each other. The World Bank estimated that Guyana's road density is 0.024, whereas the average for Latin America and the Caribbean is 0.462. So road connectivity, transportation infrastructure is a huge infrastructure gap in Guyana. And I think the government is already making investments to address that. So linking up the various regions and populations in Guyana through a developed road network is going to be key to opening economic opportunities, particularly since transportation infrastructure is weakest in the interior, and therefore that contributes to disparities between the so-called rural and urban areas. The lack of a deep water port reduces Guyana's export capacity. As you expand roads and link populations and increase economic opportunity, electrification becomes a huge issue, and their substantial demands will be made. Therefore, a lot of the oil rents will have to go into developing the infrastructure. This itself will generate a lot of employment. Perhaps the most concerning aspect in terms of the fundamentals is the low base in education in Guyana. And therefore, building human capital over the next 10 years is going to be vitally as important as infrastructure, and some may argue even more so. Knowledge, skills, creativity are essential. Guyana's education outcomes have been below many Caribbean countries and in Latin America, many countries over the last 20 years. Closing these skill labor gaps is going to be essential. But however, as the economy expands, as Deacon Arthur has just pointed out, and you see that expansion in the booming sector feeding through into the services industries and other industries, construction, etc., how does Guyana meet this skills deficit? It has to rely on a fairly large amount of foreign labor. And if you look at the Emiratis, that is exactly what you will see. If you don't allow skills to come in a managed way, to meet local demand, you will find that labor costs, as labor becomes very scarce, that labor cost over the next 10 years will soar, and that will give you your Dutch disease type effects through its impact on local inflation. The other challenge in terms of the skills is what skills? Skills 10, 20 years ago are not the same skills needed today. I can say more in the discussions on these skills because I think the skills deficit is the main challenge to diversification and long-term growth in Guyana. Primary school, secondary school, and all levels of education attainment need to increase in Guyana, as they need to increase in most developing countries, including the Caribbean. But a lot of the education today and skills today that has to be developed has to be done digitally. Skills need to be digitally enabled. People need to operate in a digital space, whether you are sophisticated and as an engineer or an accountant to other less sophisticated forms of skills. So therefore, the integration of digital skills training across the education space in Guyana is going to be essential, and that is true in all Caribbean countries. Finally, I would say the agricultural sector also offers a significant opportunity for diversification. As Guyana opens up its rural transport and sector, diversification into new, more technology-intensive agricultural products is possible. Wood production, diversified agricultural production, services sector development, all these are potential areas down the road. But as I pointed out, you must confront the fundamentals of weak infrastructure, weak skills, and also to improve the business environment. Sorry if I went on too long. Thank you.
No. Actually, you captured it in a very good way, nicely for Dr. Sobers. I mean, I think we've looked as the conversation has evolved. We get a sense of what the current landscape is. We get a sense of, what kind of strategic industries we ought to be thinking about in the context of diversification. And so, Dr. Sobers, add to these insights.
Thank you, panelists. You all have, really helped me put my thoughts together with some of the things I was, kind of bouncing around. And so what the audience, I believe, would want to be able to do at the end of this talk is definitely be able to identify what over-reliance on oil and gas looks like. Right? And McIntyre did that by basically pointing out to us that, the inflationary spiral would be a problem. And the main thing that Guyana needs to do is to remain stable. We could look to the Middle East, and he did that with some of the historical things that happened, and I'll come back to that again. But the main need is for stability. And pointed out one of the things that I always talk about, the fundamentals. We start with the fundamentals. What does Guyana need fundamentally? An artist spoke about that. What are the Guyanese people expecting? How are they going to see the material benefits? And it comes down to the infrastructure. The they spoke about, we heard about the infrastructure needs with the road density compared to the rest of the country, Caribbean, poor connectivity over a large landmass, need for deep water ports, electrification. All of this ties into diversification. And my question was before the talk began, I was wondering, should diversification be pursued or can it be pursued concurrently with oil and gas development and infrastructural development and socioeconomic development? And so, what I'm hearing from the panel is that we need to look at the basics, and we also need to take into consideration what the Guyanese population is expected. They're expecting employment opportunities, Arthur pointed out. They're expecting to see investments in infrastructural development and to have the opportunity for multi generational wealth. But we need to keep an eye also on some other things that are moving, such as where is all of this, or where are the petrodollars going? We have the sovereign wealth funds set up, and it could be a bit political, and that might need to be looked at again. So my question: should it be concurrently? And what I'm hearing from the panel is that it's a medium to long term priority. And if there's an opportunity with time, I'll give enough time for the panelists to answer that question. Should it happen concurrently? What should happen first? Do we do the basics first for the infrastructure, the expectations of the population, and then look at diversification into manufacturing, right? We hear about the limited input that Guyana is able to make, say, for instance, in downstream sectors, as the Middle East has done, as Trinidad and Tobago has done. That ties in with the workforce capacity and capability, the challenge of labor shifting from one industry to the next, taking somebody from bauxite industry and putting them into the oil and gas industry for another industry. And the education. I hope I'm not. I hope I'm
No,
tired.
no, I think you you're
Right? But when
capturing.
we look at manufacturing,
Yeah.
we have to look at the infrastructure for manufacturing,
Yeah.
and we have to look at the people who are going to work in the different areas. But Ghana has come with something. There's a traditional industry we have. Listen, the rest of the Caribbean, we are so looking forward to Ghana being the breadbasket of the Caribbean. We want reliable, low prices on food. We're really looking forward to that. Ghana has the land space. And so should it be that the petrodollars now is fed into traditional industries like agriculture and forestry and fishing and mining? Guyana would be a very wealthy country even without the oil and gas, right? And so I think part of avoiding the over-reliance is, putting the petrodollars into this. But at what stage? Is it now? Is it in the medium or the short term? I think I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm throwing back to the panel. So let me leave you all to attack some of those. I'm really interested to hear.
No, I think Dr. Sobers raises, and I'll have both you, Arthur, and Meredith sort of join in on this, right? So I think she's raising what initially kind of motivated my thinking in terms of, it's like, what's the policy framework? Like, what are the policies, incentives that are necessary to kind of encourage investment and growth in the non-oil sectors? And how should we be doing it, as to your point? And then the other one, I think, what are the lessons that we should be drawing from other countries? What are the lessons should we be drawing from Trinidad and Tobago? What are the lessons that we should be taking from the Emiratis? Which countries have done this well? So who's done this right? What are the models that we ought to follow? Because just to Lauren's point, as I sort of writing and thinking about this, be concrete. I want to give you some advice about what to do. Show me some models that have actually carried this out in an effective manner. What's the broad theory of the case for how we ought to be unfolding this business of diversification? And I think to McIntyre, you really kind of gave me something which I didn't, this insight of what our current state of diversification. We have the bauxite, we have gold, we have these, in a way, separate industries where people don't transit between them and there's nothing connecting it. So what's the advice you give to the policymakers at this moment? I'll start with you, Dr. McIntyre, and then Arthur.
Thank you, Terence. And Lorraine really hit on the sort of core issue. I mean, the challenge is two or threefold. As Lorraine pointed out, the key thing is that you have to maintain stability. If you don't maintain stability, all your plans get derailed. Huh? And therefore, the policy framework is to have an accelerated level of spending by the state sector as it pursues its transformation that does not result in an inflationary spiral, right? Guyana has to be given a lot of credit because Guyana did not do like many countries and went out spending before it even got oil production. So it has to be given a lot of credit. And at this stage, we're not seeing an inflationary spiral. One quick point, Terence, that we should note, that as Guyana has ramped up spending on over the last couple of years in infrastructure and other things, it's doing so with a declining debt to GDP ratio, which is very unusual. Guyana's debt to GDP ratio, estimated by the IMF, is at 31% in 2024. Saudi Arabia is at 25%, the Emiratis are in the mid-30s, and Qatar is at 47%. So Guyana has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world. That's because the debt can be amortized. There is more than enough oil revenues to finance Guyana's development. It doesn't have to borrow substantial amounts. Okay, now you say, how do we sequence? Well, because you have weak fundamentals, or the country has weak fundamentals, you need to focus your investment there. But the investment has to be well targeted to the needs of the country. So you have to put in road networks that are really aligned to creating economic opportunities. Your electrification has to support that. And then your education focus has to be one on lifting the educational attainment and moving the basic educational indicators, literacy, school enrollment, etc., etc. And at the same time, I point out integrating digital skills. If you attack the fundamentals and create economic opportunities, people will see other spaces in which to do business outside of the oil sector. But I think the agricultural sector will require special focus. You don't want wages and nominal incomes in the non-agricultural sectors, in the mining, in the oil, etc., to too far outstrip agriculture that you draw all the way labor away from agriculture. It will be a significant achievement for Guyana. And the government, from what I have read, and others may know a lot more than me, the last budget with the minister, they are focused and see the need to sustain a broad-based economic expansion. But the agricultural sector will require special attention. And if Guyana can expand its economic base, inclusive of higher levels of food production, that would be a major achievement. The last thing I would say is that Guyana's economic expansion is going to be large enough to have linkages with the rest of the Caribbean. It will stimulate private investment from the rest of the Caribbean, which can be a source. But again, Lorraine, the key issue is going to be the labor supply. We have to be able to manage the labor supply. And the Guyanese population does want to receive benefits. Employment, incomes, and other things would be a key aspect. But also you can give the Guyanese population more assets by providing more housing, giving people more housing, that will give them the right to own their own land, their own home. Also better access to not only education, but healthcare, which will give people a much better well-being and standard of living.
Arthur?
Yeah, I think from speaking to some of the oil producers and equipment providers in Guyana, they all mentioned that lack of skilled labor is essentially the biggest bottleneck in terms of growth in Guyana. I've heard that repeatedly by different companies. So I think that labor part is significant, and how you create that labor is either through migration, right? Encouraging migration from other regions in the Caribbean, or encouraging people from Guyana that are living elsewhere to come back, or through the ground up, right, which is education. I think the best way is to do a mix of both. But I think by doing that, you create more skilled labor, you lower the costs, and you create more, basically more attractive environment for companies. I think companies, when determining when to establish a manufacturing facility or develop a new project, or open a new office in Latin America, what we often see is how much is it going to cost and how much money am I going to make, right? So if opening a solar panel manufacturing facility in Mexico is half the cost than what it would be in Guyana, of course, no one's going to choose Guyana, right? So I think you have to lower the costs. And a big way to lower the costs is by increasing skilled labor so that there's not as much competition for those people. Lowering the electricity cost is another big one. We all know that Guyana has one of the highest costs of electricity. I think it's 24 cents per kilowatt hour. I think the gas to shore plant is going to reduce that, hopefully by half, which should make it more attractive for some manufacturing and energy intensive industries. So I think that's a big one as well. And tax incentives are always very attractive for international companies looking to establish businesses offshore, right? That's what happened in Ireland. They attracted many businesses. In Puerto Rico is part of the US, but they have a lot of tax benefits. Now what's happening with the US, with the IRA, you're seeing so many European, Chinese, all types of companies developing manufacturing facilities in the US because the subsidies are so attractive. Now that the Guyana is positioned like no other country in probably in Latin America, the Guyanese government has money and a lot of it. So maybe providing subsidies for businesses or some types of tax credits will attract businesses to come establish offices there. And that encourages employment, encourages immigration. It's all kind of a circling loop, right? A feedback loop. So I think that's a big key. And in terms of other countries that have done well, Brazil in the region has done fairly well in terms of really scaling up their oil and gas business, really creating the technical expertise. A lot of it's through Petrobras, who has a lot of issues, as we know, in terms of corruption, but they're also one of the most technically abled companies in the world in terms of offshore exploration. I don't think a state-owned oil company is the solution for Guyana, at least not right now, but some type of training institute, which I know there's already some foundations that are being created specifically for oil and gas sector, is always a positive. The UAE has done incredibly well. They have been able to diversify pretty effectively away from oil and gas. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned there. Investment in technology. I know that's such a broad kind of saying, but there's so much focus on AI and what's next in terms of technology that, and this is a relatively new business, right? A relatively new field. If Guyana starts investing money towards becoming, some sort of player in that whole value chain of generative AI, there's a lot of upside. That could be establishing data centers. The Guyana is not far from the US, from Miami. You could put submarine fiber cables that connect to Guyana, create data centers with very cheap land in Guyana and lower electricity costs, which is coming. And you send that data back to the States. So, there is a role to play in all of these different value chains. Guyana's just got to find which one it is. I don't think, creating a refinery for its oil is a solution, but I think going more downstream is definitely what they should be looking at.
This question that you just raised about broadly innovation and technology, and thinking through kind of the role that innovation and technology could potentially play in diversifying. And I intended to ask about whether or not there were any specific, technological advancements that could propel other sectors. That was the way I was framing. So perhaps maybe an investment in AI could be something that unlocks our agricultural sector, that unlocks our mining sector, that unlocks, when you think of it, agriculture, mining, manufacture. I mean, the manufacturing of spirits. It's a very thin base on which to build this this diversification project. And I keep coming back to this, and so maybe I want to, because I've also noted that in the chat, the comment on provision of greatly improved and geographically accessible health services is also fundamental. What do you think about the promise of the hospitals, etc.?
Terence, this is absolutely essential. The provision of high quality social goods is not only important for strengthening the foundations for long run growth and development, but it's important for people's overall living standards and sense of self well being. We can't see this as only coming through increases in nominal income, driving wage increases, and nominal income increases. Obviously, people's nominal incomes want to go up. But however, we need to make sure that we strengthen the provision and supply of social goods. Access more sophisticated technologies is going to require more skills. The country can maintain a balance between enjoying the resource rents, investing in these fundamentals, while it waits for diversification to take hold as the economy expands and the fundamentals improve. The question has to be that you don't allow instability. If you manage to maintain stability while you are doing these things, investing in the fundamentals, that allows you to create the space.
Can I ask you a question right there, though? I mean, we did one of these programs in London, and the discussion was about the roads, and one of the participants became very adamant, and he or she, I can't remember now, said, "Well, I can't eat roads," and so this need to see some kind of, how do we balance? You see, I think this is the, and maybe I want to open this up. How do we balance? How did Trinidad and Tobago balance? How did we balance so that it's clear we don't want to have some wild inflationary spiral and the whole thing goes out of control, but it's also clear that this, if you will, tempering, kind of necessary tempering, I think from my perspective, from our perspective, but it's creating a certain social risk that is potentially could be destabilizing. And so the issue is what's the balance?
Well, look, it's not a science, and it's a difficult balance to maintain. But increasing employment, and that's why targeted assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises, as investment takes place, as the state expands employment in the social sectors, as the construction sector activity increases, for infrastructure and so on, that will generate employment. But you also want to incentivize people to get into business, to take advantage of rising local demand and that kind of thing. So supporting that is important. So people can't eat roads, but you can give them more income. You can give them opportunity. You can give them access to better skills. You can start to give them access to better health. You can start to also incentivize them to get in business, support their activities to become small scale entrepreneurs. All of that makes a difference, but it's not an overnight sensation. Expectations are to deliver now, and that is very understandable. People are coming out of difficult circumstances. They understand the country has a huge resource rent coming in, so they want an improvement in their standard of living now. That's very understandable. I mean, just for example, look at what's happening in the US. All of this, the numbers on the US economy look strong, but the population doesn't feel it because inflation is undermining their purchasing power, and that's what they see every day that they deal with it. So I think, it's important to communicate that message. People will see development benefits over time, but at the same time, Terence, you have to be transparent in what you are doing. People must understand exactly what you're doing. And how you're spending the money, where it's going, and who the and where the benefits are. The final point I make, so I don't want to go on too long, that we haven't mentioned here is climate change. Guyana has a very good opportunity to move ahead of many countries in bolstering its resilience to climate change. So therefore, dealing with sea level rise and all that kind of thing in its infrastructure, which will sustain its populations long beyond this, is going to be vital. Maintaining their support for the Amazon forest and what they're doing there for carbon credits is also going to be an essential aspect of this. And therefore, that aspect too guarantees the country's future. And also the savings, what you all call the Sovereign Robin Wealth Fund, the savings fund, that guarantees intergenerational equity from the oil fund, and they also will give some satisfaction as you move on.
Dr. Sobers, I know that you've thought a bit about this, mitigation and resiliency. How do you see the role of mitigation and resiliency in the context of diversification?
Oh, it would have to be part of the infrastructural development. That has to be the background, the thoughts, before you put in a road, before you put in a highway, before you do all of that. Any infrastructure that is going in place, the effects of climate change, rising sea level, change in rate patterns, flooding, it's going to affect agriculture and a wide manufacturing, everything. So that would have to be an underlying consideration for all of development. And I see here, I just want to, if I may, bring up about two of the comments I saw coming on screen.
Yeah.
So we have Ambassador Compton Bourne with us, and we're very pleased to have him as part of the audience. And he underscored what McIntyre said about access to healthcare. Over a large area, roads and so on is aligned to economic opportunities, but the population needs to see that they are having good access to healthcare. In addition to the other things that the population should reasonably expect, with housing and education. And then we had another comment coming in from Irwin Alicop, and his position is that investing in fundamentals, which we discussed, will raise the standard of living, and that is what people are expecting. So we see that there's a interplay between everything. And I think that is the job of the policymakers and the planners and so on, to sequence that properly. And I'm glad you brought up climate change. That's my usual area, but that has to be the undercurrent for everything that is being planned very seriously, because we don't want to put down infrastructure and then it is destroyed by serious forces of nature.
Actually, can I stay with you there? When you brought up climate change, and thinking from purely Guyana perspective, we're a country that's 6 feet below sea level. We have these big seawalls, which are a part of national psyche, and it struck me that the environment, in some way, is a kind of barrier which we didn't surface in the initial, is a genuine obstacle to diversification, right? So you could diversify and forget the environment and be undiversified in a moment if the water jumps over the seawall. So I'm thinking, what are some of the other barriers that you see for diversification in Guyana? I think McIntyre mentioned earlier just this disconnected way of the economy on which we were currently set up. The fact that our labor is not easily able to cross from one thing to another. What are some other ones that we perhaps need to surface so that someone thinks about this, they understand?
Actually, as I look through my notes here, I see that the panelists have covered every single area. The only area that probably didn't get as much attention was subsidies, but we covered labor, we covered education, we covered infrastructure. Those we really need to have the fundamentals in place, and that has been covered. Let me see what I have bolded out here. Transparency and corruption. We only mentioned transparency. We didn't mention corruption. But that's an issue. Ease of doing business. So we say we want more business. Is it easy to do business in Guyana? What needs to be in place for ease of business? I think that's probably the only one that I can think of that probably wasn't discussed. I would say ease of doing business, getting things done at a pace that the rest of the world is accustomed to doing business. I hope that answers. Did we really talk?
No, that certainly does, and it ties in with the next question that I wanted to put to both Arthur and Meredith. So Leland Hazelwood notes that sort of now that funds are available, what are your thoughts about one R&D and application of appropriate technologies to improve competitive and expansion of established industries? So I think we've kind of agreed on that. Initiatives to inculcate and expand domestic entrepreneurial capability and activities. So I think you did mention these questions of subsidies and trying to find ways to strengthen small. But in number 3, I don't think outside of AI, we've spoken about any new industries. What are your thoughts, both Arthur and Meredith, on potential new industries that could animate the diversification project now, and more broadly, kind of what are some ways in which we're working with CARICOM to accelerate the single market and economy so as to maybe allow for the easier movement of skills among folks in the Caribbean region? I'll maybe start with you first, Arthur, and then come to.
Sure. Yeah, I think the data centers that I mentioned, it's something that's very attractive and flashy. I don't know if it's realistic based on Guyana's realities right now. What Guyana does have is low cost of land, pretty low cost labor. It needs to lower its electricity costs and needs to improve its digital infrastructure to be able to create something like that. So, my focus at AMI is largely on energy. So I think a lot about things in terms of electricity. I think there's a lot of room for the creation of a solar generation in Guyana. I know there's some wind also that can be done onshore to supplement perhaps this gas to shore plant that's going to be built, that's being built already. So, I think those kinds of projects, they lead to some uptick in employment when they're being built, but they're not really long-term kind of value creations. I mean, they create value for the company that owns the asset. So, it wouldn't be my main focus. I think Guyana has a lot of potential to maximize its agricultural residues. I know a lot of companies are looking at waste and residue from agricultural sectors to produce biofuels made out of those. So, not only exporting or consuming the agricultural goods that Guyana has locally, they could also maximize those values by exporting those residues. I think outsourcing for call centers, Guyanese people speak English, relatively low cost of labor. That could be an attractive option for some companies that want to offshore that service. And that's more of a long-term benefit than some of these other more extractive, let's call them, industries that I'm mentioning. So I think it's finding pockets like those that keep the employment domestically, that are not just extracting some value of the country and exporting it elsewhere, is really where we have to focus. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Meredith?
Yes, thank you, Terence. I understand the need to focus on potential new areas of investment, of economic activity and exports and so on. I understand that. But I think in the current environment, what I would suggest is let's keep a laser focus on strengthening the fundamentals, because you will not get diversification without stronger fundamentals. And therefore, on the skills side, on the education side, the government is making investments. And if you look through primary, secondary, and tertiary, I think building the capacity at the University of Guyana, establishing an engineering faculty at the University of Guyana that can provide the high skills needed for the petroleum and gas industries, and downstream of that is going to be important. Trinidad did that, I think, in the 70s and so on. I think Professor Ken Julian. People more knowledgeable might be able to speak to that. But I think that's important, developing the tertiary education infrastructure at the University of Guyana, and doing so while the University of Guyana and the UWI collaborate increasingly on this, but ensuring that the throughput to the university also increases from primary education, secondary education, and so on. So the question is, building these institutions, where do you get the teachers from? Where can you supply all the teachers that Guyana will need to lift the educational attainment of its population? And that's why I say I think the government is going to have a guest worker program that allows it to supply the skills it needs as it tries to build its own people. And therefore, I think that's an important aspect of this. That's something that the social partnership in Guyana has to agree on. The other thing I would say is that the government is already spending a lot in infrastructure and these things. And the question has to be, Professor C.Y. Thomas made the point a few years ago about whether Guyana should be giving I don't know if you call it an oil dividend or annual oil income payment to its population. That the surplus from oil revenue should not go entirely through state-sponsored activity or through the market system in the private side. And maybe they should do that on the side. I'm not sure about that, but that's a consideration people can look at. I personally feel at this point in time, the most important thing is to lift the living standards and development prospects of the Guyanese population. And I think through the social goods, the housing, the social sector access, quality of services, better education, some rising nominal incomes, more support for medium-sized and private enterprise, focusing on the agricultural sector in the rural areas, I think that's where they should go.
Yeah, I think you've given us a really nice kind of encapsulation of it there. And I perhaps forgot, I don't know if I said at the beginning, but I'm doing this thing from Houston, Texas. I came to visit the Offshore Technology Conference, and it turns out that my flight is in my flight back to New York City is in, it's about 2 or 2.5 hours, and so I don't want us to go on much longer, and so I'm going to perhaps start with just asking for a final thought, and then sort of wrapping that up. So maybe I'll go around the way I'm sitting on the. So I'll start with you, Dr. Sobers, and then Arthur, and Dr. McIntyre, and then finally myself. So a final thought on this question of diversification and avoiding over-reliance on the oil and gas industry, and some of the things that we ought to be thinking about when we consider that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here, and it just confirms what we know, is that Guyana has a lot going for it. There's proximity to Latin America and Caribbean markets that is good for manufacturing, for agriculture, and even for more tech-focused industries, as Arthur mentioned, like data centers, with the subsea cable between Florida and so on. Has expansive land area, lower energy costs is anticipated, and so there's the opportunity for energy-intensive industries. Of course, there's an abundance of natural resources and raw materials. So with so much in hand, what should Guyana do? We're hearing loud and clear from McIntyre that Guyana should focus on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are going to pave the way for everything else. And a very fundamental question that Arthur asked is, what should Guyanese people, what are the Guyanese people expecting? And we're hearing loud and clear, once again, the basics: housing, access to healthcare, and with that, better education opportunities, and which leads to a better and a more capable workforce. There will be need for important labor. That's an opportunity for CARICOM labors. And so overall, diversification for Guyana would be deal with the fundamentals, improving the workforce so that manufacturing, agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining, direct foreign investment, all of that can happen.
Thank you. Yes, Arthur?
Yeah, just echoing some of that. I think lowering cost of electricity is very important to attract companies to Guyana. Increasing the amount of skilled labor, both through migration and education. Um, Also creating a regulatory framework that is attractive for investments. So that could be through subsidies, like we see the IRA, or through other tax credits. I think if you build this environment that is so attractive that people cannot look away from it, people will come, and with that, it brings in a whole other range of investments and high quality capital and labor and all those things that are important to grow a community for the long term. But yes, we can't ignore that there are basic needs that need to be addressed before any of that. And it's a lot of those things that we've been talking about here, healthcare, education, housing, food security. I think most of the people in Guyana don't really care if you have, a data center that's generating millions of dollars revenue. They just want to have food at the end of the day. They want to have electricity at the end of the day, and they want to have a roof over their head. So if you can't provide those basic necessities, you just don't create an environment that is suitable, that's stable enough for all of these factors to come and take place. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I want to take advantage of you and raise a kind of issue on this one, man. So yesterday at the event, one of the participants, spoke about the volume of helicopter traffic and between Guyana and the FPSOs offshore. And in some previous iteration, discussing these questions of the fundamentals, the issue was, what kinds of, how quickly can I prepare Guyanese to become a helicopter pilot? And have we forever lost the capacity to be the folks who are native Guyanese to be a part of that? And I wanted you to just kind of, in your last thought, to sort of say, well, okay, as we look at sort of broad global trends, what's going on? I mean, I see China kind of pulling in. I see, Arthur mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and the way in which it's sort of, forcing manufacturing to come back to the United States. I see Europe sort of carving out its own little space where it wants to be, where it wants to do its own thing. And I wonder, from the perspective of your thinking, is there a space for Guyana to be, for 800,000 or 1 million people to be the sort of, not the service industry, but the helicopter industry? And what sort of steps do we take in this direction? So I want you to add that, somehow reflect on that, and whatever you close us out on.
Terence, you certainly know how to assign easy assignments, but no. But thank you very much. Look, there is. Let's first of all continue to emphasize that, unlike many countries, Guyana's first few steps here have been solid. They haven't gotten themselves into fiscal recklessness and instability and so on, and that's to be commended. The Guyana can have a very positive, transformative future. It can find its niches in the wider global space. There's no question, if Guyana maintains stability, it will have a very, I would say, significant presence not only in the Caribbean, but in the hemisphere. As a country whose incomes are rising, whose development prospects are positive, and as Arthur pointed out, it will attract increasing attention as it gets the fundamentals right. Now, whether that's in helicopters or in A or B or C, difficult to say. But given what exists, I think the rural areas of Guyana have always been a potential tourism site and that kind of thing. I think the agricultural sector, to me, offers a lot of possibilities, but there's some challenges, Terence, we've spoken, of course. But the technology aspect of this is through the adaptation of technology into local processes to make them more efficient. So a government that becomes not paper-based, but e-based, for businesses that use a lot more technological solutions to how they manage their business and improve their efficiency and that kind of thing. Rather than exporting technology, I think it's more a matter of importing technology, adapting it, and increasing local efficiency. And that's why I go back again that this question of having the skills is so important. But Terence, we have to be mindful. Financial Times 2 months ago pointed out that there's a global shortage of skills. And everybody is competing for skills. Even the Chinese have in programs putting up now trying to attract foreign-based Chinese back to China. The social sector bothers me because we lose a lot of our nurses and teachers to the United States. And therefore, maintaining and retaining people with those skills is going to be important. So Guyana has to open itself to the world. It has to open itself to the world, not only investment, but it has to open itself to the world in people and have access people where it doesn't have the people to supply. And I think the Emirates provide some good guidance on this in terms of the worker programs that they have. And I think if Guyana does that, that will complement its own efforts to strengthen the skills and so on of its own population.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we've heard some very kind of sobering thoughts. I think the way I want to maybe reiterate, I think you set out at the beginning, we have to maintain stability and not let the inflation get out of hand. And that's our first order of business. And then we begin to build on the fundamentals. So, I want to thank you all for participating today. It's been I want to thank David, who's not here, but who's been a kind of strong force behind what we've been doing. I want to perhaps say, because it's the last, I'd say thank you to two people who quite no one ever sees, Nigel Kelly and Utamu Bell, who are the social media persons and some organizers behind the scenes to kind of make the thing work. And I also want to thank the audience. We've been very, very fortunate. We've consistently had people from the United States, from Canada, from Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Suriname. We've had people from Finland, Switzerland. It's amazing how wide the audience for Zimbabwe, Mozambique. So I want to thank everyone who's tuned into one of these things, and we'll start thinking now about our themes for the next year, and the next 12 months begin in June. So on the second Wednesday in June, we'll start the new year and season 3, and we'll continue to see how we can offer ideas and thoughts that can help in the transformation of Guyana, and to ensure that I think perhaps this is my last thought shared at the meeting yesterday. What has happened is not something that will happen again. So the likelihood, the probability of this happening was very, very small, and it has happened. And so we as Guyanese perhaps need to be sure that we win this game. And winning this game means that we act smart, that we have smart policies, that we listen to smart people, that we, as Meredith McIntyre said, we open up ourselves to the world, not just physically, but the world of ideas, so that we can make good decisions in this regard. And so thank you all again, and have a wonderful day. And I wish you all well in whatever your endeavors are today. All right, take care, and thank you. I'm going to go grab my bag and get to the airport. You guys be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Bon voyage.
Thank you.